So, how many of you were familiar with the Onsie corpus before this paper? Is that something you've heard about before, or one hand? Yeah?
Oh, okay.
Hands, okay, great. Okay, so actually, all of this links back, in fact, right to when I was a master's student at MUN, because when I finished up my first year, Sandra Clark was hosting the Methods in Dialectology conference, which just happened to be in St. John's that year. And that was also the year when the Onsie Project was sort of, it had like it had its public release. And Elizabeth Gordon and Peter Trudgill and all the other folks involved in the project were at that conference, and they were talking about this amazing corpus that they put together. And I remember sitting in the audience and thinking, oh my God, to work on that would be a dream. Like, how great would that be? But it's never going to happen. I'm never going to be in New Zealand. So when I had a chance to go for a job there, I jumped at it because this corpus is so exciting. I mean, since Onsie came out, other people have been trying to construct these types of diachronic corpora, but this was really the first and the most important because it was so critical for looking at new dialect formation. So the reason I did this paper sort of goes all the way back to first hearing about the corpus and thinking about the possibilities that it allowed. Specifically, why I did quotatives was because I have a long-term interest in quotatives, and as I talk about in the paper, there's been a really big emphasis on synchronic apparent time studies. And if we think about it, when we think about variation as sociolinguistics, a lot of the time what we go to immediately is apparent time. But of course, the method also works for real time, and I had such a great opportunity to take a look at the system as a whole instead of just focusing on be like, right? Because I think what we assume is that, well, be like's this awesome innovation. We all use it. Don't even try to pretend you don't. We all love it. Don't even try to pretend you don't. And I think that we assume that the system had to simply react to be like. And I think a lot of us just worked from that position. And I wanted to see if that really was the case, right? Like, was there all kinds of stability and then boom, be like hit? Or was there other stuff going on and then be like just happened to come into the picture? So that's where all of this started. A, I could do it. B, I wanted to. And C, there were bigger questions that I could address.
Awesome. Right, and so it looks like you, the data sets that you have available, all the corpora they have available allows you to do that really nicely.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, one of the things with that set is that, yeah, I mean, yeah, it's all there, right? It's all transcribed. It was all already made ready for me. So what I needed to do was go in myself and with a couple of research assistants and just start systematically going through all of it. So, I mean, that work is the result of a lot of RA hours.
I was going to say, this is, I think you said 4,500 tokens.
Yeah.
That's the one of the largest counts to date for quotatives, a study of quotatives. How many hours did it take?
I don't even know. Honestly, I can honestly say hundreds.
Yeah. Okay.
Right? I mean, I put in easily, I know I put in at least 100 myself, and then I had 2 RAs who worked really extensively on that corpus with me as well. So honestly, probably 300, 400 hours of extraction and initial coding, and then I went through and added a bunch of coding on my own, and then checked all of their coding. Yeah. So it was a huge investment.
Yeah, for sure. And did you have an idea of what you're going to be coding for? I know you've been doing work in this area for years, and you know the literature extensively. But were there new things that you came across in this that you didn't know you're going to be coding for initially?
Okay, so one of the things I started doing with this corpus, was really paying attention to whether or not there was an addressee, which was something I hadn't done before. And I started paying attention to where the verb was. So that was something we'd always kind of done, right, with say. So the difference between I said wow as opposed to wow is what wow he said, which is actually not a real token. You would never come across that. But anyway, I started paying attention to that because the historical data, I hate saying this, but it was so boring to code because it was all say. Everything was speech and everything was say. And so it started to feel really dull and repetitive, so we started to notice these other things in a way that we really hadn't noticed them before. And that's when we started to get excited and we thought maybe these things were doing things that they don't really do anymore because you had so few resources at your disposal. And it turned out they weren't all that interesting, actually, in the end. But those were two things that come to mind right away.
Yeah, the data shows how boring it must have been. Oh yeah, on page 351, the table 3, all the things that you couldn't look at, you couldn't model in Gold Bar. There's 1, 2, 3, 4 factor groups out of your 7.
Yeah. Yeah, because there was nothing going on.
Right. So, and this is, okay, and then, so the table itself is just for the use of say. What was 89%? And then the next one, the next highest marker was 0 quoted of say at 8%. So yeah, there's probably not enough in there to even do an internal analysis on 0.
No, I mean I played around with it, but there just wasn't enough. So I didn't feel there was so much I wanted to put in the paper. So what you guys should know is that this paper, the original submission, was twice as long. It was a beast. It was big. There was a lot that I thought that was interesting, and I should have gone back and looked at that paper, but I haven't. But I know there was a bunch of stuff I had to take out.
Okay.
Because it was too much, right? The editor said, yeah, but you need to cut it in half.
Mm.
It was a 60-page manuscript the first time it went in.
Wow.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's the part that I mean, we can all talk about our favorite parts and our favorite pages and favorite graphs and tables, but the focus on and the emergence of mimesis throughout the corpora is something that I'm particularly interested in because we hear it all the time now. People make up their own voices for people they're quoting all the time, but when did that start?
Okay, so it's there anyways, right? I mean, it's a constant presence in those older data. It just wasn't doing a lot of work. I mean, there's this one great quote where a woman quotes a parrot. So she there was a talking parrot that someone in the village had, and they had a woman in a wheelbarrow, and they were taking her off in the wheelbarrow to jail for public drunkenness. She was in the wheelbarrow because she couldn't talk, and I mean, she was blind, drunk. And the parrot says something, and you know, the woman, as she voices the parrot, she does that prototypical, you know, I mean, she isn't saying Polly wants a cracker, but she's doing that kind of voice effect. So it's there all along, but what you can see is that it's the only verb it can really do anything for is say, and it's not actually a robust effect within the data, right? Like it just isn't actually a significant determinant, and it isn't until we get into sort of the mid-20th century that we can see mimesis starting to partition different verbs so that it becomes a significant predictor. So it was always in the system. It was just it was this resource that people had, but it wasn't differentiating between different verbs and different modes. the way that it does now.
Right, right.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so I'm looking at the very first table 3.
Yeah.
Said mimesis was already there, always there. 184 out of 544. So that just gives you a set, if I had the numbers right.
Yeah.
So it's a small amount of the tokens with that correspond to say.
Right.
Would you find that most of the say tokens were just using like kind of verbatim speech? Like here's what you said without adding any flair or color.
Okay. So yeah, so just sort of modal, if you will. I mean, yeah, most of it was that. I was shaking my head no on verbatim because quotation, no matter what the verb is, it's hardly ever verbatim.
Sure, right.
But yeah, most of you didn't get any noticeable change in voice quality, in pitch, in intensity. They weren't doing accents. I mean, people now really like to do accents. It doesn't matter if they do them well or not. None of that stuff was there. It was very, if I can say this, it was very flat. Right? So you knew it was quoted speech because of the syntax and because of the verb.
Right.
And because of, say, like the deictic references in the pronouns within the quoted content, but you had far fewer signals in the sense that, yeah, as I said, mimesis was there, but it wasn't nearly as frequent.
Right. And now, is that because of the nature of the recordings? Like it was. So maybe if you want to tell us a little bit about the mobile unit, like what was the goal behind it, and what were the circumstances or the environment in which the interviews were done?
Sure. Okay. I always actually like to preface this by saying that I think the mobile unit data is better in many respects than the contemporary stuff.
Okay.
It's better. Now, of course, the sound quality isn't as good, right? Because they had those big reel-to-reel recorders. So it was the New Zealand Broadcasting Service, literally in 1946 and 1948, loaded up those big reel-to-reel recording devices in a van and drove around New Zealand to small towns on both the North and the South Island looking for people who had been born and raised in the colony to find out about life growing up in a colonial context, because this was the first generation of native-born Kiwis. So they wanted stories. They literally were asking people for their stories, what are the things that happened to you growing up in a colony?
That sounds like a great resource. And I know MUN has a collection of Herbert Halpert recordings that essentially did that too. I think he loaded up a recorder in his car.
Yeah.
And wandered around Newfoundland.
Yeah.
Essentially the same thing.
Yeah, I mean, it's amazing because some of the stuff that you get, I mean, yeah, you're getting these sort of fabled storytellers in their communities, right? I mean, part of it they were saying who are the good storytellers because the whole purpose was to put these stories on air on Radio NZ. So they wanted people who were entertaining. But what you end up with, you don't actually have very polished practice stories in the sense that they're not fluid, right? They still have all of that spontaneous speech stuff going on in them, so lots of repetition, lots of pauses, lots of clearing the throat, lots of ums and ahs, all that stuff is still there. But they managed to avoid those bad interview contexts for the most part, right? So, because anyone who's done field work, you're going to have one day where you're just like, that interview was awesome, that was great, and you can kind of forget that, yes, it's you, but it also is the person you're interviewing. Because then you go the next day and you interview someone else, and it's just plain hard work. Okay. And they didn't have a lot of those in the mobile unit because they were specifically looking for people who had stories. Right? Instead of saying, we're just going to sit down and talk for a little while and trying to steer someone into a story, that was the whole purpose of these. So the data are really good. They're really vernacular. They're entertaining. They're funny. They're heartbreaking. They're just good quality materials. Yeah.
Are they better storytellers than Newfoundlanders?
No, no, not possible.
Oh, right. Okay, great. Yeah, so I'm just wondering, going back to the question I asked before, stuff about the mobile unit. Is it so? To what extent do you think the data that came out of the recordings, um, and it's probably the case that it's a reflection of the circumstances. So they were strangers talking to strangers, really.
Right.
Does that have any effect on the type of quotatives that you're going to get out?
Um, I don't think so. I mean, in a sense, I would say less so than in a traditional sociolinguistic interview.
Less than, okay.
Yeah, for the same reasons that I just said, right? Because these are people who were there to tell a story. And I mean, for me, I know when I listen to my students' field work, I'm going through those recordings and I'm looking for narratives and I'm looking to see direct quotation. And the more of it I see, the more I feel that they've managed to really set somebody at ease. Because reporting is, speech reporting anyways, or thought reporting is necessarily performative, right? It's all about drama. And you can't do that, at least you don't do it as much if you're not feeling comfortable, right? I've told the same story a lot of different ways, and the more quotation I use, the more involved I actually am.
Right.
So I think proportionally we had, did I include that? I think I looked at this. I think there was actually, per word count, I think this is one of the things I had to take out. There was more quotation by word count in the older materials than there were in the more recent materials.
Okay.
For me, that's a really poor indicator. I hate that kind of indicator. But for me, it just sort of shows that, yeah, they really did get people to just sit down and tell stories and get involved, as opposed to the newer stuff that has a lot of meta-commentary and non-narrative interaction.
Right. Were the newer recordings done by students at the university?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I found even when I was doing my own field work for my master's, the people wanted to like wax poetic about different things that were happening in the community rather than telling me particular stories. They wanted an analysis of everybody in their high school or who they hung out with and all the different groups without necessarily getting into the nitty-gritty details that we're all after.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's right. I mean, when we did all the Victoria projects, it was really hard to get people to tell stories, and some of the field workers were more successful than others at steering people away from just sort of blah, blah, blah to actually telling a story, right? It's hard to get people in a narrative mode, right? Well, tell me about, when your first child was born, or when you got married, or how did you meet your wife? Oh, well, a friend set us up.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. Right? Whereas these old stories, oh, well, let me tell you, and you get a narrative out of them.
Yeah.
Well, it was more common in that time period also. Like, storytelling was an entertainment. It was nowadays more people watch TV versus tell stories to household. So it's not as common unless you're maybe from a small town. I don't know.
I wonder if technology plays a role there as well, though. Like, if you relied on stories when you were a young person in the early 1900s or late 1800s, not only for the sharing of stories, but also you relied on oral histories and oral information for the sharing of important information as well. Where you maybe didn't have a radio in your community yet, maybe you didn't have a newspaper, you certainly didn't have a television.
Yeah, that's a good point too.
Yeah, I mean, even the nature of family dynamics is changing, right? Because I used to tell my students, well, because we talk about storytelling as a way of capturing cultural recreation and learning norms. And for me, I know growing up, we sat down every night at the dinner table to eat together as a family, 7 nights a week, and storytelling was a big part of what went on. And when I ask my students about this, every year, less and less of them actually have this memory of the mealtime being a big family time when you all sat down together. And so I think that it's harder to find for a lot of reasons, and one of them is because our cultural norms are changing, right? One of the places where we could count on the learning of storytelling skills and the reproduction of storytelling skills is being eroded by our changing lifestyles. So that's just, for me, I have no science to back that up. Right? You would never want to put that in a paper, but that's an impression that I have as well.
Right. No, I'm sure there's something to it. I mean, not to sound grumpy and old, but like the storytellings are through Twitter now.
Yeah.
Message.
Tell me in 140 characters. I don't have 5 minutes.
Right. Yeah. And not everybody, and I'm sure it wasn't the case back then, that everybody had the gift of the gab and were exceptional storytellers. I'm sure a few stood out the way they do now. But perhaps the oral communication was a little more significant to the community, to the culture, and what we do nowadays. Yeah, certainly.
Yeah. But no, the mobile unit materials are absolutely fabulous. I love them. They're just fun to listen to, and the stories are great.
It's kind of like a modern day, or the prototype to the StoryCorps projects that are out now in New York City and even across a number of different cities and states. You can go into a mobile studio and record a story or record a conversation with a friend or a parent or a grandparent, and just it's an oral history project, and the idea is to archive these stories for future generations. Yeah. So I wonder if you could compare. If it would be a good comparison of, say, like if they have something like this in modern times in New Zealand, maybe an initiative by the radio broadcasters, where you can compare those recordings with the mobile unit recordings, and if there would be more of a parity between the type of data that's collected.
Yeah. Question. You do have that, right? You guys can go online. You can watch the Quake Box.
Oh, okay.
The Quake Box is, I think it's actually a shipping container that they've set up in downtown Christchurch, where people go in. You literally go and you sit in the box, and there's a recording device in front of you, and you tell your story about living through the 2 big earthquakes.
Oh, very cool.
Right? I mean, because the city's still recovering from those, so in a sense, those are very much oral histories.
Yeah.
That are on par with what you get in the mobile unit. But I think that at the end of the day, I'm actually not. One of the things I found with those data is that, in a sense, the variable controls the comparability of the materials, because where all those quotatives happen is in narrative,
right?
Which is a really specific style. They're in complicating action of narrative. So there's a lot of that other kind of talk, right, that we're talking about is irrelevant, because that's not where these quotes are happening anyway.
Yeah, sure.
Right? So the variable itself sort of imposes a control in that sense, because the data are, by their very nature, it's the same kind of talk. Now, are the stories as long? Generally, no. Right? But and you don't get as many from individual speakers. But at least it is all narrative. So in that sense, I felt comfortable with the comparison.
For sure,
yeah. Yeah.
Great. Anybody else have any anything that you can pipe in any time with any questions you might have, or it can be on topic or even off topic. I'll ask another question.
Yeah, go for it.
This is more of a technical statistics question than, and it probably has a very short and simple answer. You used a gold bar for looking at, for teasing out the effects of different factors on the use of different variables, like say and be like and so on. Did you use, where is it here? Somewhere on page, no, maybe it's a different page. 354, you're looking across corpora at the increase in first-person recording. So is that a chi-square test that you did there?
Yes.
Okay. See, I thought it was short and simple.
Yeah, it is. Yeah. I can actually speak to the stats if you're interested, because there's a lot of background to this paper, which is that the first time I drafted this, I'd been talking to Joe Salmons, who's the editor of Diachronica, and he really wanted me to give him something. So I was 3/4 of the way through writing this paper, and I said, Joe, I've been writing this thinking I'm submitting it to you, but now I'm not sure it's actually right. So I sent him this draft, right? Like, it was just for him, just so he could glance through it. And he looked at it, and as it turns out, he sent it to the entire junta, the entire editorial board. So, and they all looked at it, and they said, yes, we would like you to submit it. So I did. So the first time it went in, it went to Diachronica, and it sat with them for 5 months. And what happened is that 2 of the reviewers, you could tell, were variationists, and they had no problem whatsoever with the statistics. And then it went to a non-variationist who really wanted me to be running mixed effects and all those types of things.
Oh, wow, okay.
And so Joe said, can you redo the stats? And I said no. And the reason I said no is I had a number of reasons. The biggest reason was that I wanted something that was comparable to all that other quotative research that was out there, right? So if you're going to be saying, hey, no, it's not just be like, there's these bigger things going on, I really wanted the stats, the model to be the same, right, so that we knew we were comparing like with like.
Right.
So that was number one. The second one is that I disagreed with the point that the mixed effects were going to give us something better, because of all the work I've been involved in where we've run it both ways. Goldvarb has given us the same thing, it's just how it presents the results. Okay. But I find the mixed effects often are harder to interpret. So I didn't want to do that. And then the third reason was that I really felt that I had justified what I'd done already. And so I didn't do that. The bigger problem is that with those other types of statistical modeling, see the difference, the one thing Goldvarb has that all those other things don't have is it has that don't count condition, right? So that within a factor group I can say, look, for grammatical person, I only want you to consider first and third because those are the biggies that have always been implicated and there's no existing claim for second persons, right? So if I now include second persons in the run, I'm adding a third thing that's necessarily going to affect how the other things come out. But I can't, in mixed effects, say, for grammatical person, I just want you to consider first versus third. I actually have to cut all second person data out of the data set completely. So it's a huge chunk of data that actually just disappears from the whole analysis and not just from one piece of it.
Right.
That ties back to my point about I wanted to make sure we were comparing the same thing so that I could really safely say this is a bigger thing than just be like.
Yeah.
Right? So that was a hard decision though, right? I mean, because Diachronica is a fabulous venue. I respect Joe Salmons immensely. I would have loved to have had the paper there, but you know, my place was no, and his place was, well, if you don't do it, we can't publish it.
Oh, wow.
So, and you know, fair enough. So I turned around and sent it to Language Variation and Change, and I sent the full reviews I'd received already from Language, which I'd already done all the revisions they'd asked for, apart from the stats. And so I sent all that to Rena, told her what I'd done, and then within a couple of months, you know, I had the go-ahead from LVC. She just wanted me to cut it in half. Right? So I had to shorten it, but the core substance remain the same. But so statistics are an interesting question when it comes to this kind of work, right? And what you can and can't do. And for me, comparability was really, really important, which isn't to say that those other things aren't good. They're fabulous. They're really great, in fact. But it wasn't the right package to use for something like quotatives if you want to do like with like.
Sure, right. So for on that note, then, so for those that aren't familiar with mixed effects modeling, what is that used for? What is that good for?
Well, actually, mixed effects would have been great here because what it I mean, I'm sure I don't think I can add anything that you haven't already told them, but what Goldvarb does is it assumes that everything has a fixed effect, so it's not going to pay attention to, say, individuals in your sample, or it's not going to pay attention to, say, individual birth years, right? Instead, you kind of have to group everybody, right? So I can't say, well, this person was born in 1851, but this person was born in 1852. Rather, I have to say, let's look at everybody born in the 1850s, and let's look at everybody born in the 1860s, right? So you don't get those types of continuous variables, and you can't say, take birth year into effect, right? You just have to find different ways to group the data. And I think that would have been really useful. It would have changed some of the claims I could make because of all the data I was going to have to cut out, essentially, and model differently.
And not to mention rebuilding a whole new data set, too.
Yeah.
That would all set. It's a monster of a file.
Yeah.
The last thing you want to do is go through it and adapt it for another statistical test, right?
Yeah, I mean, that's not a great reason for not doing it, so I didn't list it, right? Like, whenever my students say, well, I'm going to have to do that by hand, I'm like, yeah, you are, right? Like, that's not a good reason.
Yeah.
Now, if we need to get this thesis submitted by next week or you're not going to be able to defend it, okay, then let's find a way, let's find an argument that isn't just, I didn't have time. But it's true. I mean, that was part of it for me because it had already been sitting with them for 5 months, and it was term, so it would have meant another 5 months turnaround on my side that I just didn't have. I wanted it published.
Rightfully so. Anybody
want to ask me anything?
I've got a question.
Great.
Okay, so it's not really related to like the core, it's more of an aside thing. But I was wondering about the rise in the quotative think over time, well, to a certain point. And I was wondering if in the earlier data sets, did people not refer to their own thoughts, or did they do it in a different way so they could still use say? Like, does it reflect?
So I said to myself.
Yeah. Okay.
Right. I mean, that's the only. If it was the only way to tell in that early stuff if it was thought and they were using say was to put that to myself, and in fact you still get that today, right? So to disambiguate say out loud because it is a speech verb, you have to put that to myself on it. That shows up. You can see there's only 35. In the whole data set, say in the mobile unit, there's only 35 overtly specified addressees. I'm pretty sure they're all, 94% of those are stuck on say, right? So they really weren't quoting thought, and it didn't matter if it was theirs or anyone else's. That internal stuff didn't come out through direct quotation. I'm not saying you could never quote yourself. I'm saying you didn't do it directly. Because there's a lot of other ways you can do it, right? There's a lot of epistemic resources in the language. And in fact, Isa Buchstaller, she had a book come out last year on quotatives where she says, no, we always did quote thought, we just did it differently, right? So we didn't use direct quotation. So maybe it was via indirect, right? Mm-hmm. So I was thinking that maybe I should go over there, or I was thinking I should ask him if he wanted help, which is, you're still quoting your internal thought processes, you just aren't doing it in a direct quotation format. Yeah. So our ability to quote ourselves isn't new, it's just that we do it directly is. Which is cool, right? I mean, why should that have changed? I don't know.
Yeah, well, what does cause this expansion of, or even the competition between forms? So you see on page 361, the nice graph at the bottom, or shows the increase in the number of competitive or competing variables that people use.
Mm-hmm.
And what? So I think, did you say at some point this is driven by pragmatic concerns or pragmatic need, functional need?
That's what I think.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that it became more and more in vogue, more and more acceptable to talk about yourself. You certainly see I mean, we talk about colloquialization, and I think in a sense, being able to talk about yourself is a reflection of that. And people from different fields have noted that that's been increasing more over the last century and a half anyways. It's usually discussed in, as an American thing, but I think that the fact that you see this increasing ability to directly quote inner thought and attitude, you don't just get it in these New Zealand materials. You get it in British data, you get it in the stuff that we've looked at so far in my Canadian data. It's there too. Sally and I had it in Toronto. It's in the Australian data that I've been working with a woman in Perth. So I think it's a broader tendency, and I think it could be considered part of that overall trajectory toward colloquialization. It's more okay to have an opinion and to share it. Before you were expected to keep those things to yourself.
The rise of the ego, the rise of focus on the individual.
Yeah.
Compared to the group. So how young were the youngest speakers in any of the corpora? So I'm asking because I'm interested in hearing about how the preteens from your MA thesis work compared to, say, senior citizens or older adults. Do we have different quoting styles?
Yeah. But now, how much of that is generational and how much of that is change? That I really don't know. So let me think about this. So the youngest speakers in the mobile unit were probably in their 60s.
Okay, all right.
Right? Like they were an older group. Let me figure this out. So the youngest speakers in the Onsie sample that I used here were in their 20s. The part of the issue with that corpus is that in the Canterbury corpus, so it's a monitor corpus, right? So every year they're going out, they're doing more interviews, they're adding data to the corpus, but the sampling protocol is set, right? So you're doing 18 to 24, I think it is, and then you're doing 50 to 65. Those are the target speakers. Now, sometimes people hit outside the target, but you're not getting a huge chunk of, right? Like those people are rare. So once in a while you might get a 16-year-old or you might get a 15-year-old, but you're not getting really, really youngies. But from our own data here, I mean, one of the things we noticed when we were working on the Perth data, we talk about a big data set, like that one's massive because we've got comparable data from New Zealand, Australia, Canada, and England. So that one's huge, right? Like we're talking 20,000 tokens of quotation, which is a lot. Yeah. But we noticed a big difference even between speakers born in the first half of the 1990s and born in the second half of the 1990s.
Oh, interesting.
Right? So, because we had all the 1990s together and something wasn't, like we could just tell that something was off. So we started cutting it in different places, and it was like 1994 turned out to be a really meaningful year for whatever reason, for Australia anyway, for Western Australia. So, so what we need now, right, are real-time studies, because we need to know what happens as speakers age. And I know that Sally Tagliamonte and Suzanne Evans-Wagner are looking at real-time data from a few of the same speakers to see what happens as you get older. I know for me though, the older I get, the more be like I use. When I actually use say or go, I notice it because it's exceptional for me.
It's very marked.
Yeah, and that wasn't always the case. So, then again, I'm cool, right? I'm young at heart, so I got friends. No, I'm just kidding. But there's a huge difference. I mean, you can tell. Just listen. You don't even have to know anything about the speakers, but if you look at the data from an older speaker and the data from a younger speaker, you just know without having been shown speaker information, you can roughly gauge them.
For sure, yeah.
Yeah.
So on the topic, and maybe we can close on this note. The current research you're doing, is anything new happening? Are there any new changes that are? Is there an expansion of the quotative system in another way?
I want to say no, but you know what? The truer answer is I don't know.
Okay. Yeah.
And frankly, that's because in this newer work, we're focusing on explaining just. I hope no one's offended by this, but we're trying to explain just what the hell is going on, because be like is weird. Really, if we step back and think about it, be like makes no sense. It defies everything we know about language change, in the sense that it went from 0 to like 90, literally, in 35 years. That's unprecedented in terms of rate of change, and it went global at the exact same time, right? So people will say, well, you didn't really get be like outside of the US before the end of the 90s. Wrong.
Right.
That's wrong. And when we look in our data sets and we start paying attention to where the major breakpoints are in the data, it's the first users around the world were all born in the 1960s, all of them. And and then it's like, okay, were you born in 1970 to 74? And if you were the generation that first pushed this thing, and it didn't matter if you were in North America or Australia. And that's weird, right? Like that, it shouldn't look like that.
Sure, and one of the interesting things, you can, it's not restricted to just being introduced at the younger generation. 60-year-olds, 70-year-olds can just decide one day to start using it too.
Yeah, they can pick it up too. So it's got a lot of really weird things. I also don't think it's grammaticalization. I've just finished writing a paper on that actually, where I think grammaticalization is I think we're just looking at it completely the wrong way. It's not a grammatical form, so we need to rethink what we're doing with it, and we really need to examine the syntax more carefully, because it's not a lexical variable, but it's not a syntactic variable. It's somewhere else. So it's confounding on a number of levels, and I think that we just sort of we don't think about those things so much because we're so focused on, well, it's this super awesome new thing and everybody uses it, and are we all doing the same thing? And oh, look at that, it has the same constraints in York as it does in Christchurch. Oh, that's really awesome. Yeah, but why? That's weird, right? Like every time we sort of break it down to its elements, we had a big Skype with Anthony Warner at the University of York, and we sort of started to lay out the different things, and he said, you guys, like that, I need you to stop and think, like this is non-normal.
Right.
So we're kind of focusing now on its non-normal things and trying to figure out how do we embed this given our understanding of language and historical language change. What do we think? So that's really where the newer work is going, as opposed to is it still doing things. But I am hearing new things. Well, because like Paul, I'm on a playground a lot of the time.
Oh, yeah.
And so you hear the thing kids are doing, and my son can do things with Be Like that I can't. So, I mean, it is continuing to develop. So it's not, it ain't done yet, that's for sure.
Absolutely, yeah.
Could you give us an example of something your son could do that you couldn't?
Yep. So I can do, I can't question a direct quote with be like. So I can't say, like I can say, what did you say? Or he went, what? I can do that. But I can't say he was like, what? But my son can. And he's done it to me a few times, right? So I remember once I was saying, he asked me, and I was like, huh? And my son said, what were you like?
Yeah, that was the question. So he's perfectly fine with saying, what was he like?
Yeah.
Say?
What did he say? He can do that.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. What did he quote? Like, what was the content? Whereas that, for me, is just out of bounds.
Right.
And it is actually pushing now. It's expanding. You see all these new tense and aspectual things starting to happen to it, which we'd expect, right? The more embedded it becomes. So it used to be really limited to past tense morphology and present tense morphology, regardless of temporal reference. But now you're getting progressives and you're getting modals and you're getting all kinds of new things going on there too. So those are two things.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Very good. Well, we're just about out of time, so if anyone wants to sneak in a question before we log out here, we're welcome to do that.
I do have a question. Have you seen if the V-Light is also used on the internet?
Sorry, I missed your question.
If the V-Light is also used on the internet?
On the internet.
Mm-hmm.
Like in written text, maybe online posts or text messages.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah, I've definitely seen it. Yeah, online. I mean, not as frequently as Go, but that I think that is more about the fact that like is confused. Quotative like is confused with all those other likes, and so it carries some of that baggage as soon as we start to write it down. But I've definitely seen it. I've seen it on forums. I've seen it in chat. I've seen it in comments, like at the bottom of a feed, which I actually try to avoid. So there's probably a lot of them places like that, but I don't. I tend to ignore the comments. But I have seen it in places like that.
Do you text yourself?
No.
No. So you're not an active user of like in text messages then?
In text. No, I do it with email, though, quite regularly. No, I don't have a cell phone. Don't judge me. I don't have a cell phone, so I don't text.
No, I think that there's two people on this earth that don't have cell phones that do text messages then. So that makes you and I.
Oh, great.
Yeah.
I knew I liked you.
In that sense. Okay, well, thanks, Alex. It was great chatting with you.
Happy to be here. If anybody thinks of anything else, you can drop me an email anytime.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay,
That was
so
fun.
we will. We look forward to chatting with you again in the future, and maybe you can sit on one of the reading groups that is coming up in the next couple of weeks too.
Yeah, there's some really good ones coming. You guys are lucky. This is a great idea, for sure. For sure. Let me know if I have anything else you're interested in. I'm happy to do this anytime.
Yeah, okay. We're happy to have you back.
Okay, cool.
Okay, talk to you soon.
Bye, guys. Thanks.
See you later.
Okay, see you, Laura.